Hello and welcome. Today I want to take a look at Vladimir Putin's natal horoscope. This is in terms of part one. In part two, I'll look at his evolving astrology, how the influences that are going on at present are impacting on him, his potential prospects, and also his decision making. Now, obviously, Mr. Putin is a very controversial character. And one of the things in natal astrology that's critically important is the time. And there is some doubt that the known time of 9:30 a.m. in the morning, he was born on the 7th of October 1952, is exactly right. However, erecting a noon chart is not something that I particularly like doing. All astrologers use them. If something happens with a celebrity or a politician and you don't know their time, you can get a feel for the key aspects in the chart, but it does mean that the house system, the house overlays, the ascendant and the moon can possibly be wrong. So, especially if the moon or the ascendant are on a cusp. So I'm going to work with this time that's out there. And let's just have a little look round and see if we can understand this person. So, of course, his sun is in the sign of Libra. Librans have a reputation for diplomacy. And you can see up here is his sun at 13 degrees 55. So just under 14 degrees in Libra. But it's actually in the 11th house. Now, the 11th house is quite an Aquarius energy, so it can be a little bit detached. Of course, it's also in the second decan of Libra, so it's governed by the traditional ruler of Aquarius, which is Saturn. So that adds a little bit more sobriety to this position. But the 11th house can also be quite logical, along with that detachment, and perhaps it will have a certain set of values, the 11th house. It doesn't mean to say that a person's values will necessarily align with other people's. But one of the most notable things that we can notice here on the screen is this fixed star of Algol-Rab. Now, fixed stars is a form of astrology called traditional astrology, and fixed stars are very, very important, particularly when they're on the sun, the midheaven, the moon, the ascendant, and so on. So he has two fixed stars that I think are particularly notable. And the first one, Algol-Rab, is quite a malefic fixed star. It has the energy of Mars combining with Saturn. Mars is about drive. Saturn can be about coldness and restriction. And of course, that second decan of Libra does bring a little bit more a bit more of a clinical energy. But just to give you a bit of a flavour of what Algol-Rab will do to that sun, it's linked to a malicious, thieving, merciless, fiendish, repulsive, lying personality. It can result in a violent death. It can also give people military skills, but with the potential for a final downfall. Also, destructiveness, malevolence, fiendishness, and scavenging are all part of this fixed star. So I would say for a fixed star that's so close to the sun, and it's literally only 28 minutes away from being exact, is very, very powerful. Now, the other thing we need to look at in a person's natal horoscope, of course, is the ascendant. And Mr. Putin's ascendant is 3 degrees 10 minutes in Scorpio. Scorpio energy can be quite discreet, quite private in its approach, but very thrusting and to the point in its observations on other people. So people who've got Scorpio ascendants or strong Scorpio energy in their chart, or even the sun, can be quite blunt, but not particularly keen to reveal their own motives. So that seems to make a bit of sense. So we have that Libran energy, which on the face of it would suggest someone, especially in the 11th house, maybe wanting to network and communicate with people. And I actually feel that Mr. Putin has got a tendency to do that. He has lots of relationships that go back a long time, whether it's with Angela Merkel, Gerhard Schroeder, with, the president of China. They seem to have quite a connection. So relationships are very important. And of course, it's not just because his sun is in Libra. He has this cluster of other energy there too, but I'll get to that shortly. But the ascendant means that his approach to life is quite careful, guarded, doesn't necessarily show his cards very easily. And his midheaven, which is where he connects with the wider world, is in the very charismatic sign of Leo. And you can see that Pluto, the planet of power, but also of secrets, which is the co-ruler of the sign of Scorpio, the modern higher octave ruler, that's right on that 10th house. So this guy was destined to be very powerful and have a high visibility role, even if the way he goes about his role is in some ways in a very low-key way. So we don't necessarily have a lot of ideas of some of his motivations. For example, he's fiercely defensive around his personal situation. But this midheaven is also conjunct a fixed star. And this fixed star is Alganubi, and can also be known by its other name of Ras al-Assad Australis. And this is also a fixed star that has a strong Mars conjunct Saturn energy. Bold, cruel, heartless, adulterous, criminality, lying, poverty, and he was said to grow up in poverty, few friends. But it gives a bold, bombastic, Brutus and destructive nature. And that, again, very, very close to his midheaven. It's only 30 minutes away. So we've got two very influential fixed stars, which are both to do with calculation, with power, and using that power in quite a ruthless way, to be quite honest. So those are two things that really stand out from his chart, those two fixed stars. I'm not someone who has a great deal of insight into fixed stars, so I'm telling you this as almost like your GP, your general practitioner doctor, giving you a bit of an overview. There are specialists in fixed stars, but very interesting. Now, if we look at the next phase of his chart, obviously the sign of Libra is cardinal, so it's very much to do with power. And Saturn, the planet of structure, is very much to do with boundaries. And you can see that that's in the 12th house. Now, Saturn in the 12th house gives people quite a remote personality sometimes. Sometimes they can feel very isolated. But also, it's very close to the sun. You can see, within about 4 degrees. So that's bringing more coolness to the potential warmth that the sun can have. And that algorithm with that Mars-Saturn conjunction, and this sun being in the second decan of Libra, governed by Saturn. So a very Saturnian energy, which is sternness, discipline. Have you noticed that Mr. Putin is always dressed very sharply? His tie's never undone. It's always immaculate. So this is a person that has quite a metronomic approach to managing his role, but also a strong desire to control. Now, we also have Neptune, the planet of dreams, the planet of spirituality, the planet of illusion, very close to Saturn. Now, in a natal chart, that combination can give people great artistic skills. And I understand that Mr. Putin is very gifted at languages, and I'm going to show more of why that might be later. But Saturn conjunct Neptune is a really interesting aspect, particularly in the 12th house. This is creating detachment. And when you put Mercury in there as well, Mercury in the 12th house points towards somebody who could have a tendency to keep their thoughts very much to themselves, very much into research. And of course, Mr. Putin came through the KGB, was in charge of a division, I think, in Eastern Germany at the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is a person quite steeped in the secret machinations of state. And when you've got Neptune on Mercury like this, and you can see within 2 minutes, there's no compunction at all about creating an impression which seems very equable, this Libran energy, very agreeable. But I feel that there is the potential for distortion, for lies, hiding things. It's very smoke and mirrors, this combination. But the 12th house, of course, is the last house of all the 12, and it's very much to do with the final end of the process. So it would give someone great wisdom in some ways, and great ability to understand the psychology of situations. Now, whatever your view of Vladimir Putin, I think that he has for a long time been very skilled at anticipating what the responses would be of his opponents. Now, whether this is true of what's happened this year since the 24th of February is another matter, because it seems that strategically things haven't gone quite to plan. But I feel that there is a scheming, calculating, highly intelligent ability to understand how opponents may react, but also how to charm them. And that's very much the Libran energy. So a lot of charm there. Now, he also has Venus, the planet of love and affection, in the first house, in Scorpio. When people have Venus in Scorpio, they often don't have sort of in-between relationships with people. It's either full on one way or the other, polar opposites, love or hate. So that Venus in the first house, I think, does give him a desire to present himself in a very, not necessarily a stylish way from a fashion viewpoint, but certainly to present himself with a degree of traditionality, smartness, everything is very buttoned down. So the impression that he likes to create, and you can see that Venus is relatively close to that ascendant. This is this ability to groom and to build relationships over a long period of time. Not with everyone, perhaps, but relationships are very important to him. And I think some of his issue is that he feels that NATO in particular have not listened to him over various issues, whether it's been Iraq or Libya, or it's been to do with the Balkans. He feels that he has been prepared to negotiate with them, but that's not always been received in the way he wanted it to be received. And that's built up a lot of resentment, I feel. Now, also, if we see up here, we have his midpoint. Now, his midpoint is at 8 degrees, 25 minutes in Leo. And this is the nub of this person, because when people talk about him being a Libran, or even talk about him being a Scorpio ascendant, we need to know what the balance of the moon, which you can see in the very quick-witted mercurial sign of Gemini, but in the 8th house, very deep, so a mixture of quick wit, intellect, but also the 8th house, very scorpionic. So quite private, really, very private. But if we take the midpoint between the moon and the sun, at that 8 degrees 25 in Leo, Leo, again, a bit like his midheaven, a bit like his Pluto, and Black Moon Lilith, which I will come to later, This is all wanting a certain amount of respect, admiration, possibly, affection. Well, he's quite canny, isn't he? So he's not necessarily expecting people in the wider world to have affection for him. And his modus operandi is obviously about power. But I still go back to that point. If we take the fact that his midpoint is in the first 10 degrees of the sign of Leo, therefore it's governed by the sun, this gives him a very powerful charisma at Leo energy. So he needs that recognition and he needs that respect. And that's very important to his business model in how he manages people. And all these associations and relationships that go back many years. So remember, relationships are very important to Vladimir Putin. And it's said that a lot of the people that are in his inner circle are people that were collaborators with him when he first became a more notable player in the city of St. Petersburg, but I think he became mayor. So those relationships have gone on for absolutely years. And that is one of the very interesting things about his management style. It has a lot of continuity. So fixed ascendant, fixed sign in Scorpio, fixed Venus ascendant. Also, he has Eros, the planet of how we feel things deeply, also in Scorpio. He has a moon in the 8th house, very scorpionic. And also this midpoint, along with the midheaven, Pluto and Black Moon Lilith, all in fixed energy. We also have Jupiter in the sign of Taurus, fixed. Now, Jupiter in the 7th house can bring validation or benefits from relationships. Now, you can see that his Jupiter is opposite his Venus. I actually feel there may be some vanity that's not necessarily obvious to some people, but this talks about a generosity to those people who keep very much close to him and follow the model that has been created over a long period of time, and very consistent in those relationships, potentially very generous to that inner circle. Now, Mr. Putin is also known to be a keen sports person. So he plays ice hockey. He's very accomplished at martial arts. He likes the stage shoots of him on horseback, or has a fantastic love of wildlife and nature, apparently. So if we think of Mars, which is very much to do with that adventurous side of our nature, but also where we might be more action orientated, in the sign of Sagittarius, it's an athlete all day long. So that's a great place to have Sagittarius, the Mars, sorry, if you're an athlete. But it's in the 2nd house. It's very much about everyday money. Now look where Pluto is. Pluto and Mars and Black Moon Lilith, his deepest desires. Perhaps some of these desires are not for public knowledge or consummate or sharing, but Mars and Pluto in a trine, 2nd, 10th, power, money. Then we could also see Venus, the lesser benefit, Jupiter, the greater benefit in traditional astrology. So they're in an aspect in opposition. But I feel that this means that his penchant for money is very strong, but also through relationships. He also has the path of fortune in opposition with Mars. Path of fortune is in the 8th house of longer term finances. So the desire to do well financially is very strong, but the desire to conceal his approach to finance is very strong. a secretive position for Pluto, even though it's in the 10th house. People with Pluto in the 10th house, including my good self, often end up in some kind of role where people sort of know of them, but can be a little bit reluctant to be too open about their personal affairs. So, like Vladimir Putin, I can be quite a private person. So, but for him, that power potential with Mars, that's a lot of desire there, really absolutely maxed up desire. But we do have a T-square here, and that's with Jupiter, Pluto, and the node. You can see the node is actually very close to his 4th house cusp, or IC, and you can see it's 20 degrees, so just about, about one degree and 11 minutes away from his 4th house cusp. So a big desire to keep his family affairs very, very private. But that T-square, for me, especially Jupiter square Pluto, Jupiter relationships, Pluto power, I shall covet what you have. So that's a very, very powerful aspect. And people who have negative energy between Jupiter and Pluto often get what they want out of a situation, however it affects other people. Now, Mr. Putin has, as I said before, is a very intelligent man, I feel, but he also is driven very much by philosophies or particular ideals. Why would that be? Because the midpoint is in the 9th house of international affairs. He also has Uranus there, which is a planet of radicalism, and it can lead people to push back against established norms, particularly when we see where Saturn is in its relationship with Uranus. Saturn square Uranus. So there is a tension in Mr. Putin between the energy and the ideals that he's downloading, all this 12th house energy, squaring up to his attitude to international affairs and his unique view of his own philosophies, his interpretation of, historical events, agreements that have or have not been entered into with NATO or the Americans. He will have his own very controversial and sometimes pushing things right to the edge. So he will rock the boat on the international affairs with Uranus in this position. But you can see Uranus also squares the Sun. It's a bit broader, about nearly 5 degrees. So again, a radical approach, his values. He doesn't mind pushing his view of a situation on others in quite a forceful way. You also have Uranus square Neptune and Uranus broader again square Mercury. I don't know if you saw the photo shoot when he had the recent meeting in Ankara in Turkey, and Erdogan kept him waiting for about 56 seconds. Apparently, Putin had kept Erdogan waiting a couple of years ago for 2 minutes. And you could really see the tension in Vladimir Putin. I know the Ukrainians are saying it was a body double. I very much doubt a body double could articulate that body language. There was extreme irritation, really bordering on, I feel, rage. So I think this is someone who does, despite the very controlled persona, I'm absolutely certain that in private, there are times when things get very tempestuous. And I don't think the 12th house never forgets. This is a person who never forgets a grudge. And his radical approach to international affairs, Uranus is a higher truth, but it doesn't mean to say that everyone has the same truth. So I think that suggests somebody who's simmering away with all these energies, with Saturn very much in the mix, cold rage, but simmering about the injustice that's have accumulated the 12th house over a very long period of time. So that struck me. Chiron. Chiron's where we can really do well in life in helping others, but it's where we can feel most wounded. Now, I understand Mr. Putin did lose some siblings when he was a child due to illness and did live in abject poverty. So he had some losses of siblings, very Chiron in the third house. But the third house is also about our neighbours. And Mr. Putin seems to have a bit of a track record, you know, whether it is Georgia, whether it is the Ukraine more recently, various spats and disagreements that have gone on over the years with neighbours. So not a happy situation in the neighbourhood. Now, I made a few notes. I haven't spent an enormous amount of time preparing for this, to be honest, because I'm always short of time. But his Chiron is in a quincunx with that midpoint. So his desire for recognition, Leo, his view of what the world order should be, doesn't fit together very well with the way that things work in terms of communication. So we know that obfuscation is something that all politicians do, but this is obfuscation on a different scale because it's also linked to military action and force. So I just thought that was quite interesting. Also, his ascendant in Scorpio gives him that intensity and privacy, but his family and emotional life, obviously ruled by the moon, has a degree of detachment to it because, you know, the moon in Gemini is, you know, a person, a subject is a person who may not be quite as in touch with their emotions, but his is actually in the 8th house. So a lot of intellect, a lot of quick abilities. He's brilliant at languages, apparently. So the 9th house, skill with languages. But I feel that that moon is in an exact quincunx with the ascendant. So integrating his personal individual needs with how he is invested with others doesn't work so well. And that could mean that, you know, his relationships are close, but also very private, but somehow or another, it has to be on his terms. Now, we can also see that Eros, where we deeply feel things, is in a square with Black Moon, Lilith, and Pluto. And Eros is in the first house. His desire to be recognized for his devotions has to work with his desire for innate power. That struck me as well. Now, of course, he does have the node in the third house, but it's challenged, as we saw before in the T-square with Jupiter, by Pluto. But also the node is opposite, is midheaven. So balancing his worldly role with his inner role is not necessarily so easy. But because this node is not in the 4th house, but very close to it, but his 4th house is in Aquarius, he actually finds a way because of the detachment. So this air in this part of his chart, in this stellium, his air in his part of fortune and his moon, and this air here means that he manages the detachment that goes on between the desire for closeness and intimacy, the moon in the 8th house, Venus in Scorpio, and in opposition with Jupiter. So he does have very close relationships with this inner circle, with this apparently with a younger woman. I have had a look at their midpoints in terms of the Mars-Venus parts of their chart, and they're exactly on each other's 7th house. So I think that's a very genuine attraction between the two of them. So relationships are important to Mr. Putin, but it's this issue of the 12th house, particularly with Saturn. I think there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of desire to control, a lot of ruthlessness in terms of money. The 2nd house, Mars in the 2nd house, because there's a rapacious need for money, and it's opposite the 8th house part of fortune position, and the fixed stars definitely of Algorev and Alganubi are really very influential in terms of how he approaches his role and his job. So I'm just having a quick look through my notes to see if I have missed anything that I saw. No, I think that's pretty well it. So we also need to know that, obviously the moving planets in the sky, the transits, are very, very important. He does have a solar eclipse, which is going to affect his ascendant, which is coming on the 25th of October. And that's at 1 degree 59. So it's not very, very close, but it's nearly very close. So that could have a big impact on him. But I will talk about the developing situation for Mr. Putin in part 2. But that concludes part 1. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you very much for your time. So in the second of my 2-part analysis of Vladimir Putin, we're looking at his evolving astrology. The first part, very much about his nativity, what forged his personality. Now, you can take a snapshot of a person's situation on a particular date. I'm recording this on the 25th of July, so I'm looking at where his planets are today. But you can, of course, do that future forwards as well. Now, with each client I work with natally, I take a look at what year they are in terms of their profections. So we all have a life year from 1 to 12 that we're going through. And Vladimir Putin, on his last birthday, began his 10th profection year. Now, house 10 is very much in keeping with the energies of Capricorn. So it's about status, it's about authority, it's about tradition. It can be about power. And we need to drill down and look in his chart what's going on in house 10. But in profections, we don't use Placidus, we use whole sign in terms of the house system. And there are 2 big changes that occur to his nativity within this. So the midpoint, which is in house 9 in Placidus, moves into house 10, the area that we're going to be analysing because this is his 10th profection year. And also the sun moves from house 11 into house 12. Now that's interesting, of course, because this is a person that has a great appreciation of working discreetly. That's his whole history is framed by that. But what's particularly significant about the whole sign chart for this year is that it does move that midpoint, the balance of his sun and his moon, therefore the balance of his drive and the more receptive energies of the moon. So of his overall nature, it's still in Leo, just under 9 degrees, but in the 10th house. The second thing we need to do in profections, because some people might not have any planets in that 10th house for that year, so we then need to look at where the ruler of the sign of Capricorn is. And of course, that is Saturn. And you can see that on today's date, Saturn in his situation is in house 4, very much about emotion, family, security, nurture, but that can also mean defensiveness, is at 23 degrees 21 and it's in a retrograde, which of course it is for us all, but for him in house 4. So what we need to do in terms of understanding the profection year influence, how it's evolving for him at the moment, is see how Saturn is interacting with house 10. And you can see that it's very close to being in an opposition with the midheaven, which is where he connects with the world at large. Pluto, which is on his midheaven when he was born, gives him an innate need for power. It's in, or they're both in the sign of Leo, which needs to be respected and obviously has great charisma. But having Saturn opposite these two at the present time is very hard going. So I would say Saturn opposite Pluto is one of the most important planetary influences that there is. Pluto's about transformations and power, but Saturn is about where we can feel the pinch, where we get the pushback. And of course, it can be about limitations, and it can be very cold and very limiting and very difficult. So there's a lot of energy that coming from Saturn that's opposing his global aspirations. So his desire to dominate is really being challenged by Saturn. Now, also in this perfection year that we're in at the moment, we need to look at the other planets that are interacting with House 10. And we have the node. The North Node is in the 7th house of his situation, very much about relationships. But remember, also open enemies. So in traditional astrology, this is where we get the karma of how we've interacted with people over a long period of time. That's karma is coming back on it. Now, the North Node conjunct Jupiter in this particular situation, as you can see, they're almost exactly conjunct. The North Node's just moving past Jupiter because it's inverted, moves the opposite way. That can actually be quite fortunate. But also Jupiter in the 7th house can point towards an overconfidence. And also Uranus is combining with the node, and we have Mars coming up to join them too. So by the end of this month, of course, we have, for the first time in 15 years, a connection between the three influences, the two planets of Uranus and Mars, but also the North Node. The last time this happened was in 2007. And we had the subprime crisis at that stage. And I think this is particularly significant for Vladimir Putin because by the time Mars gets to these guys, it is therefore going to see them come into a more abrasive T-square between the energy in the 10th house and the energy of Saturn in the 4th. Now, it's actually going to be on the 7th of August that Mars becomes much more exactly into a T-square. So by the 7th of August, I think we're going to see a lot more challenges come into Mr. Putin because Mars in the 7th house can be difficult. In a natal horoscope, if people have that, they can be very sporty and competitive, but it's not always easy to get the balance right between what they need as an individual and what the partner needs from them. So I think Mars obviously can be about war, and it can be about aggression, and it coming into contact with these two at the end of this month, the 1st and the 2nd of August, depending on where it is in the world, in this very rare conjunction. But for him, it's in the 7th house of relationships. But by the 7th of August, Mars is really pivoting right in between the midheaven, Pluto, and Saturn positions. And that is not going to be easy. So that's the perfection chart. I can go into much more detail with this, but I want to keep this moving because there's a lot of information to share. And in a way, I don't also want to overload you with too much technicalities. So obviously the most ancient form of forecasting comes from transit. So that's where the planets in the sky are interacting with our natal positions. So we need to just look at where the key players are. So the Placidus chart is back in the center here. The second chart is his secondary progressions. This is where we allocate 1 day for a year. Broadly, it's just slightly under that in terms of the sun, and we count forwards to 69 days in the ephemeris from the time he was born, 69 and a half, and take a snapshot of where all the planets are. His sun has moved to 24 degrees Sagittarius. That's quite interesting. And then the third chart is known as directions. That's where we use the same approach as progressions with the sun and move all the planets forwards just under 69 and a half degrees, because the sun obviously doesn't quite move at 1 degree a day, because we have 360 degrees in the horoscope wheel and we have 365 days in the calendar. So that means the sun moves slightly slower. But directions is a very powerful form of forecasting. So let's just take those transits first of all. So Pluto, the planet of power, in his moving chart is in the third house of ideas. Saturn in Placidus at the moment is in the fourth house. To be honest, if it was equal house, Saturn would be in the fourth house for the whole of this year. I'll just show you it just briefly, just to give you an idea. It's a different technique, different house system, but there you can see that his node, his Juno, and his progressed Juno, Mars, node, and Venus, and directed Eros are all in the fourth house. And of course, Saturn can be a bit of a wrecking ball in terms of all those influences. But I do use equal house from time to time, but generally I do work with Placidus. So I'm going to continue to work with that to show how this plays out for me. So at the moment, the retreat in Saturn, because it's in a retrograde through to the 22nd of October, when it gets back to 18 degrees, which is interesting because when the invasion started of Ukraine, it was also 18 degrees. And I'm going to show you something really significant with that. But you can see at the moment, it's just in his fourth house, but it will be moving back into his third. Then we have Neptune, the planet of dreams, of imagination, potentially of healing and sacrifice in the fifth house. We have Jupiter in the sign of Aries in the fifth house. We also have Chiron in the fifth house. Now, Mars is a more fleeting influence, and of course, it's moving into the sign of Gemini for 8 long months from the 20th of August. But you can see at the moment it is in the 7th house, and it can have a big trigger on him, definitely by the 7th of August. But Uranus and the node are connecting with his natal Jupiter at the moment. So that gives you a little bit of a flavour where those big outer planets are. Now let's look at transiting Saturn first of all. So the transit in Saturn, when the invasion began, and it will get back to this position by the 22nd of October, was conjunct his north node. You can see his north node is just under 20 degrees, 19 degrees 59 minutes. But also Mars in his progressed chart is conjunct that node. And so his ideas started to be accelerated, which is very third house energy. But then when the invasion began, Saturn was directly in a conjunction with those two. Saturn conjunct the North Node is one of the most potentially unfortunate influences that you can have in a secular sense of the transits, the outer transits in this outer wheel. So he didn't choose the best of times to start it in that regard. Now, the transit in Uranus and node, as I mentioned before, in the perfection chart, are in a broad square at the moment with Pluto and the midheaven at 21 degrees. You can see there's not much difference between them. The node's just under 20 degrees. So it's got a square going on. So the way he relates is not really giving him the desired recognition, respect that he wants at the moment. But you can see that that north node is also squaring his natal north node. So the nodes take about 18 and a half years to go through their cycle. At 9 1/4 years, we get the nodal return, the reverse nodal return, I should say. And this is therefore as a square during that process. So this is going to occur about every 4.5 years. Again, not a potentially good look, because the node in my chart in Placidus is in the third house, because I feel that information is a lot what motivates Vladimir Putin. And so his relationships in that regard are being challenged. His view and his way of using data is being challenged, in my humble opinion. You can see the south node's in the 9th house. So where he's coming from, this philosophy that he feels that's very important, is being challenged by that retreating North Node. Now we also have the transiting Saturn in an opposition with Pluto, just like we do in the perfection chart. And like I said there before, that's one of the toughest of all planetary influences, because you've got the resistance of Saturn working against Pluto's push to evolve us. And with Pluto, although people can use Pluto's power in a very dark way because they get what they want from a situation, and it's nothing to do with how it affects anyone else, this could be, I feel, the fact that, I was reading only yesterday that the proportion of Russian troops who die is much greater amongst the more remote members of the Russian Republic. So, and these are areas that are desperately poor, and the money that some of these ethnic, sort of Eurasian troops, the money that their parents is getting for their death is much less than any conscripts who come from the more western part of Russia. So a discriminatory approach, and that's mother, fourth house, Saturn concern. Obviously, these concerns are just little bleeps because the news cycle is so managed there, very difficult to come out into the open. I should also tell you that the move in Pluto is in a square with his natal Mercury. It is, when Pluto gets back to the end of its retrograde, which I'll just look exactly when that date is. It's going to be in October. It gets back to 26 degrees. So it's only going to move back one more degree in the retrograde, but it's still forging a very turbulent right angle to Mercury. When you have Mercury and Pluto harsh angles, so the eighth harmonic conjunction, less so perhaps, but definitely opposition and square, you can get a very trenchant, very sort of opinionated, very inflexible, very dogmatic approach to communication. And it's interesting because his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, his sun is at 27 degrees in Libra. So the boss's Mercury is conjunct his sun. And also one of the main presenters on these sort of shows they have where they argue it all out. His sun is also about 27 degrees in Libra. So the intensity of Pluto and the need to be domineering is really playing out in all three of those people's situations. So that's a pinch point on the transits. Now, in terms of the progression, you can see that the transit in Saturn, which is here, was conjunct his progressed Mars when the invasion began. So Saturn conjunct Mars, 18 degrees, and in turn, the North Node. So when you have Saturn conjunct Mars, you can create a lot of drive, but also a lot of resistance. So it's almost like the determination to achieve things is incredible, but the frustration that it doesn't go quite as quickly as you want can also be very high. So it's almost like trying to drive a car with the handbrake on. It will move forwards, but it doesn't flow. And he had that when the invasion began. So it's still in a conjunction with that progressed Mars. It's just at 5 degrees. But by the 22nd of October, it's coming right back into a conjunction. That's not going to be a good part of the campaign for Mr. Putin, I don't feel. Also, the progressed Sun at 24 degrees in the sign of Sagittarius was, or is still, in conjunction with his natal Mars. So I think this was a lot to do with the warmongering mode. So this position of the Sun was influenced by Mars, and the second house is about property. It is about land. It can be about food. So whether it's wheat or steel or melons is the latest thing that seems to be, taken from Ukraine. This desire, this power principle, very, very strong. The problem is that in his transits, Neptune is squaring his progressed sun, but also squaring his natal Mars. When you get Mars and Neptune in a square or opposition, you're talking about the trickster combination bar none, because the desire of Mars is blended with the deception of Neptune. And if you think about his progressed sun as the first house, so this is something that a lot of astrologers wouldn't use this technique, but because I come from more of a sun sign background, obviously I'm used to explaining how influences work with the sun as the first house. So it means that Neptune is squaring up with his sun and also his natal Mars right on his fourth house cusp. So the fourth house is the home, it's security, it's emotion. So there's an absolute turmoil going on, the confusion, lack of clarity. And certainly Neptune squaring Mars can be stealing. Then we've got the transiting Saturn is in an opposition with the progressed Pluto. And the significance of this is it's a bit more exact. You can see that Pluto's at 2309. So it's actually moved forward about not even half a degree since he was born, but the retreating Saturn is directly opposite that progressed Pluto. So this strain on the emotional home side of things, which I think obviously they've managed to increase their income in a way through the price of oil and gas going up, but and that means that they have just recently dropped their interest rate. But a lot of that's been fabricated through central bank controls, and ultimately, the sanctions that have been imposed upon them will start to squeeze their financial system. He's even said this himself. So I think that's a very significant aspect there being repeated. Now, he's also got the progressed Saturn. So here is the progressed Saturn. Here. On a conjunction with his natal Mercury. So do you remember that during COVID, it was said that Vladimir Putin didn't meet anyone? He maintained a distance. Anyone he had to meet, they had to provide, some bodily samples in order for them to be tested before he would meet with anyone. Initially, he was meeting with people at the end of these huge long tables. I mean, obviously, some of that was staged to create an impression of power. But one of the things that was said was that he went into a degree of isolation and solitude. So in his progress chart, he actually has the conjunction between Saturn and Neptune, which he had when he was born. It's even tighter, but it's now on his Mercury, how he thinks. So his supposition of why this invasion has taken place was based on a paper that he wrote last summer, coming out of this isolationary period. 12th house, very much about isolation, potentially. But Saturn conjunct Mercury is a deep isolation. This is like the hermit, really withdrawn, but potentially perhaps also suffering with depression, I would imagine. So that's a very interesting aspect. Now, I've told you about the progressed sun on his Mars. One of the challenges for me is that I have to read my own writing, which is not easy. So we've got the progressed Saturn, and this is very important, is squaring up with the transiting Pluto. So once more, we've got a power aspect coming into play here, but that Saturn in this overlay, it's actually it's in his 9th house in his secondary progression chart in isolation. I'll just show you that so you can see what I mean. So this is his progress chart, and there is Saturn in the ninth house of international affairs. Not a great time to launch an invasion with Saturn in the ninth house squaring Pluto, which in his chart is in house 1. So his individual desire is really being thwarted by Saturn in his progress chart. But if we look at the overlay, which we have here, then obviously the progressed Saturn is in the 12th house, and it's completely acceptable to use them in either way. But essentially, Pluto here in the 3rd house of ideas, belief systems, squaring with Saturn in the 12th house of isolation, reclusiveness. But, you know, Neptune in the mix and Mercury in the mix. We're talking about the spin, the distortion, you know, the victimhood that Russia is so skilled at doing, and so forth and so on. So very much to do with their projection of ideas, trying to spin it, 3rd house, Pluto, deceive by misinformation. So that's all there. Directions. This is very powerful directions. Perhaps the one that really stood out for me the most is the position of Pluto. So Pluto's like our inner development like nothing, because sometimes Pluto pushes us in directions that we don't even really need, recognize that we need at that time. But once we go through something very, very difficult, like we might leave a career or a relationship, and the whole process is very painful, but actually we realize that it was for the best. And so we're not always conscious of Pluto's influence. And Pluto for him is about to, it's at 2 degrees 50 minutes, and his ascendant is 3 degrees 10. So because directions move, as I said, just under 1 degree a year, in another year, it's a new beginning for Vladimir Putin, but I don't feel that he will be in office in a year's time. You know, sometimes astrologers, you know, do come out and say things in a direct way, other times they don't. You can see that because the directed chart is just the natal chart twisted round by those 69, just under 69.5 degrees. So the midheaven he's got on Pluto in his natal chart is still there, but in his progress chart, Pluto, pardon me, the midheaven is still Scorpio. But I think a really interesting thing is going to occur, because on the 25th of October, there's going to be a solar eclipse in the sign of Scorpio, and it is going to be conjunct his midheaven almost exactly, and pretty close, within a degree of his directed Pluto. And you can see therefore that the solar eclipse for him is in his 12th house of endings. Now Venus is actually going to be conjunct that solar eclipse, and that is going to bring a different dimension to bear. You know, you could say that Venus on the midheaven would be some kind of reward financially or romantically, or some kind of warmth or praise. The midheaven is our public recognition sector, how we achieve prominence or raise our profile, receive acclaim. But I actually feel that on that particular solar eclipse, for him, that's going to be the end of the story. Now, of course, the solar eclipse's influence can last as long as 6 months, so it may not be straight away. And I'm going to explain something else about that shortly, which could be significant. But in his directions, he's got the transiting Pluto is in an opposition with the directed Jupiter. And this is really important. And the reason for that, although Jupiter is exalted in the sign of Cancer, you can see it's come into the end of its story. It's only got 8 minutes to go, because it's on the Antarctic degree, 29.52. There's no 30 degree in astrology. So we just get to 59, boom, goes to naught. And Jupiter rules international affairs, philosophies, but the ninth house, it's doubling up that energy because that's very much about borders and boundaries. And that's being opposed by Pluto. And that's really interesting because when Pluto is opposed by Jupiter, people can make grabs for money, for sexual motivations, for prominence in a business, for power in such a forceful way without recognizing their limits. Now, if you tuned into the Boris Johnson chart, very interestingly, he has that as well. So that's part, I beg your pardon, it may even actually be Mars with Boris Johnson. But whether it's Mars or Jupiter, we're talking about a lusting for power. Jupiter can sort of give us sort of like arrogance and grandiose ideas. And Jupiter in the ninth house has certainly given him a lot of interest in international affairs that goes back a very long time. Now, I know he hasn't been in power for 30 years, but he's been in power a very long time. But remember, Pluto can be about death and things making way. Now, I'm not saying he's going to die personally, but I think if we look at the axis, the third house about how ideas are expressed, and the ninth house, the philosophy behind the ideas. And so he's pushed incredibly hard, but that is reaching the end of its cycle. So that's going to be really significant, I feel. Now, also, if we look at his directed Saturn, which is down here at 2735, when the campaign started, conjunct his Mars. And also not quite as close to his directed and progressed Sun, but close enough to have an impact, but certainly very close to that Mars. So when the invasion began, he had directed Saturn conjunct Mars, conjunct his progressed and directed Sun, but he also had the move-in transiting Saturn conjunct his progressed Mars, aggression, and he had the move-in Saturn conjunct his North Node, a really not a good time to stage that invasion. I'm going to show you something in my final analysis of the two solar returns for the last birthday and the one that's upcoming. But that concludes the overall picture on transits, progressions, and directions. And of course, we've looked at perfections, but I just want to show you one more thing. So in Placidus, you can see that Saturn, sorry, the fourth house goes between 21 degrees and 12 minutes Aquarius to 24 degrees and 25 minutes in Pisces. And when Saturn moves into Pisces on the 8th of March 2023, it will square pretty quickly his moon, which is at 2 degrees 54, so just under 3 degrees. So I have a little look. So in the ephemeris, which it won't be absolutely, I would say by the first week of April, the pressure that's going to be building is going to be incredible. Also, once Saturn moves forwards, it will forge a quincunx with his midpoint, which is 8 degrees 25 in the sign of Leo. And obviously Saturn will go into a retrograde. It does get within 1 degree of the quincunx in June, and then it's inverting, and it actually goes all the way back to 0 degrees Pisces, and it doesn't come out of that until November. So I think 2 degrees 54 in terms of his moon is going to be really impacted by that transit in Saturn in his fourth house of home and emotion. That's going to be big stuff. So I think that solar eclipse, which provides a 6-month backdrop, is going to impact on his sector of endings with Pluto in the 12th house of his directions, but I also think in his transits, Saturn is going to be very impactful on that moon position. And to some degree, the midpoint. Now we could, dig ever deeper into this situation, but I feel that that gives you a little bit of a flavour. So let's have a look at the solar returns now. So the first solar return I want to look at is last year's, 21. This is really, really interesting, because on how solar returns work is it's when the sun gets back to the point when the exact point that we have our renewal, if you like. So in his chart, that's at 13 degrees 55. Now it just happens that both his solar returns last year and this year's are actually on the date of his birthday, but that's not always the case. But you can see that Mars, the planet of aggression, is conjunct his sun. And Mars in the sign of Libra is in its detriment, because the ruler, Mars rules the sign of Aries. So Aries is on the other side of the heavens. And so when Mars is in Libra, it's said to be a weak position for Mars. So one of the things with Mars in Libra is that any sense of injustice would be really sort of like bubbling away. The second house is like core values. It also can be to do with land. Now, there was apparently a leaked document of him and his defense minister talking about the amount of timber that they could grab from the Ukraine. So there was definitely an eye on the raw assets. We know that Ukraine has a lot of coal mining, obviously a lot of wheat, very much involved with sunflower production as well, which is important for oils. And so there was definitely a desire, Mars, to grab, I feel. And the interesting thing is that the moon was also in the sign of Libra. So when his birthday came along this last year, it was just after a new moon. So the midpoint between the sun and the moon is actually 17 degrees 27 in Libra. So very close to Mercury and actually very close to the moon. So we have a stellium of influences in Libra, which obviously he had when he was born. But the key here is the role of Pluto. So Pluto is square the moon, square Mercury. Remember that dogmatic, dominating way of communicating. Pluto square the moon, destruction of emotional security. Third house of ideas, the midpoint between the sun and the moon, all in a square with Pluto, the planet of power. Interesting. Also, Saturn, the planet of structure, in the 6th house of health. And, we get various reports. We've seen the shaking, the stiff arm, the stiff face. I've had to take some steroids for my rheumatoid arthritis, and it can see you add weight. This is a person who's been very sporty, a tap in with his foot repetitively, which can be a symptom of Parkinson's. I don't say that he's got any of these things, but there are commentators who say he's not well. So Saturn in the 6th house, not great, but also Uranus in the 9th house, which of course he has in his natal horoscope, is very much to do with this restlessness around these ideas and also rebelliousness, and his higher truth, which may be different to some other people, his philosophies coming into direct conflict with other people. And of course the move in Uranus this year is ebbing towards the 10th house of his solar return, and the 10th house is all about his public role. So a lot of unsettled conditions which are not particularly great. He's also got Venus, the planet of money and planet of relating, in the deep Scorpio, which he has in his natal horoscope. That's T-squaring the ascendant and the descendant in his chart. So how he's approaching the year is he's picky. He's wanting to go at the details with that Virgo. He wants to purify. We have seen some commentators saying that genocide is part of the rationale. But Venus, the planet of relating in the fourth house, is T-squaring these guys. It's disassociate, but very, very tiny, only by less than 2 degrees. That could move forwards, only an Arctic degree again, that could move forwards and be 0 degrees or 1 degrees in Sagittarius, and then you can more easily see the T-square. So that's a challenge around relationships, I feel. And the Uranus-Saturn square is interesting. It is obviously a little bit broad because Uranus is nearly 14 degrees, but that's nearly 7. So it's 7 degrees. So the sixth house is about responsibility, obligation, and duty, and being precise. And the ninth house is about freedom and breaking away from restrictions. So that's creating an enormous amount of nervous tension, I feel. So I'll just check my notes again. Okay, so the midpoint Mercury and Moon square with Pluto is also influenced to some degree by the position of Neptune. So we essentially have a quincunx. So if we take that midpoint and we see where Neptune is, it's the sixth house of his health, actually, but it's also organization, and the organization seems to have been absolutely shambolic. Let's have a look at the solar return chart for this year, and boom, it really stands out for me straight away that its ascendant is squaring Pluto. So it's ascendant in Libra, bang, square. Now, in Placidus, it's saying it's the third house, but it's the fourth house cusp, which is where he lives, how he lives there. His personal security is going to be really challenged. There is a tremendous link between Pluto and Mercury, which is wonderful for precision and probing and detailing, but he also has the sun locked in the 12th house, which, remember, in equal house astrology is where his sun is natally, but in Placidus it's in the 11th house. So this is the position of endings, but also isolation. It's also opposite Chiron. 6th, 12th, that could point towards some health issues. 6th, physical, 12th, emotional, spiritual, and mental. He has got a quincunx between Pluto and Mars. Mars in the 8th house, that desire side of his nature, which is very, very strong. So some challenges, the 3rd house, 8th house can be destruction, through desire and potentially financial desire as much as military desire. There could be some kind of destruction. The midpoint, and this is really important, is 26 degrees and 51 in Sagittarius, and that's squared by Neptune. So on 2 4th house cusps, Pluto, death, transformation, rebirth, potentially, about where he lives. And on the 4th house cusp in equal house astrology of his midpoint, Neptune, confusion about where to live and how to live there. You've still got Uranus on the 7th house, in the 7th house, conjunct the North Node. So lots of changes around relationships. And the sun is in a very positive angle with Saturn. That could mean that some kind of escape plan is hatched, which, maybe he would step down, hand over power, and, remove himself to some secret location to retire. I don't think that's what's planned. I don't think that that's what they believe is going to happen. But this chart suggests that is possible. Also, Saturn and the moon in the 4th house. So his limitations could come around home, the states, the immediate security of where he lives and his domicile can be challenged. and Chiron, as I said before, 6th house of health. Also, Mars is in a square with Neptune. If you remember, that was also a feature in his progress chart. The transit in Saturn is squaring, in his transiting chart, the transit in Neptune is squaring his natal Mars, and that's repeated in this solar return. So this deception that has been going on is really still going to be in full spate, I would say. So that sums up how we think about Vladimir Putin. So we've got obviously this natal chart, which we can look at in terms of Placidus, which puts the moon in the 8th house, and his sun in the 11th. In equal house, the moon moves into the 7th house, but I don't believe he's got a 7th house moon, because that's too much preoccupation with how other people feel. The 8th house Gemini moon is much more secretive, it's much more Scorpionic. And I do feel that the sun in the 12th house makes more sense, but it does move it into the 11th house. And he does have this huge network of people that he has been a good friend to, who he's demanded the absolute total respect and adherence to his way of doing things. That's when he got all the oligarchs together and demanded that they backed him when the campaign started. So that desire to, provide leadership through a philosophy or a particular approach is actually, you might not agree with this philosophy, I don't, but that in a way is his way of looking at it. And I think William Burns, who was head of the CIA, said he actually believes this stuff. He really does believe this agenda of Russia being the victim. So then we have the whole sign chart, which is different from equal house because it means the moon does remain in the 8th house, but the midpoint does go into the 10th, which does make sense, the same as equal house, but the sun also goes into the 12th. So I get the whole sign chart for him, but of course within that, we have that gathering of energies in his 10th house, in his 10th profection year, and they're all being really assaulted by Saturn, Uranus, the node, and soon to be at the end of this month, and on the 7th of August in particular, the move-in Mars is going to get a T-square on that perfected whole sign chart. Then in terms of his transits, we have obviously the move-in Saturn. At the start of the campaign, it was on his north node, not smart. We also had the move in Neptune is squaring up his natal Mars. We also have the move in Pluto is squaring his natal Mercury. And we also have the move in Saturn is opposite his midpoint and also his natal Pluto. So his timing not great in terms of transits, and Uranus in his 7th house of open enemies. So as much as he's attacked, he's been unpredictable. The response has been incredibly unpredictable for him because he thought the West would just go along with it like they did basically on the Crimea invasion. A few sanctions here and there, but this time there was a much bigger and more aggressive pushback. Then in terms of his secondary progressions, obviously the big takeout from that was that when he started the campaign, and even now, Saturn was conjunct his Mercury and Neptune. He went through that period of isolation, writing his notes, and that seems to be a time when even his own worldview or version of events has evolved in a particularly distorted way. And then we have in the directed chart Pluto opposite Jupiter, which is just a standout, really, really power mad influence. And we also, of course, have the move in Pluto has come into contact. I just need to remind myself. So we've got the move in Pluto is, it's square the progressed Saturn, sorry. And then in his directions, we got Pluto just tucked up in his 12th house, things are coming to an end, and in that directed Jupiter, things are coming to an end. His reign is coming to an end. But, you know, he could cling on for another year or so. But I think Saturn next year, in a square with his moon, pretty well from the 8th of March onwards to the end of the year. And if it's not squaring his moon, it's pretty well squaring his midpoint. So next year is not going to be easy either. So that gives you a bit of a taste of how we can look at Vladimir Putin's prospects. And thank you so much for joining me.